This presentation is for prospects of government science advice in the Philippines. I'm Benjamin Vallejo Jr. of the University of the Philippines. Here we look at two cases. First is COVID-19, a crisis situation in which science advice is necessary. And the other one is not on a crisis mode, but in order to provide science advice for meeting environmental obligations of the government. There are two ways of providing advice. First is formal, which is done by the National Academy of Science and Technology and the University of the Philippines and government research institutions. Informal advice is largely unsolicited, and this is done by science and professional associations, individual academics, civil society organizations, and think tanks. For the crisis situation, Octa Research, which is a private independent think tank consisting of academics, has emerged as the leading provider of government science advice, especially to the Task Force on Emerging Infectious Diseases, otherwise known as IATF. IATF recommends to the Cabinet and the President policy options, but academic scientists do not sit on IATF but act as consultants. What is the relationship of Octa and government? Octa provides weekly science-informed epidemiological forecasts. Its experts come out on media platforms in which they give their advice, answering questions such as how will each economic and political sectoral interest will weigh science outcomes as risks. And Octa is conscious about providing options in balancing political and economic interests. In our second case, which is about the Maritime Industry Authority or MARINA, which deals with the shipping industry, MARINA needs to comply with the environmental conventions of the International Maritime Organization or IMO, especially in ballast water and anti-fouling conventions. Now, in this case, government interagencies work as a technical working group and academic scientists sit on these bodies. This is formal science advice in which a government agency is the one mediating the advice to different offices and agencies of the government. So there are linkages with the International Maritime Organization, and the science advice is formal and passes through a peer review by academics and other policy specialists in order to identify gaps in legal and policy instruments at the national level, whether the maritime industry in the Philippines will voluntarily comply or not with the compliance standards. And this will have to be suggested and translated to bureaucrats as policy options. Now let's look at the comparisons between the two. Octa and government, this is in a crisis situation, which is COVID-19. Octa provides informal but unsolicited science advice, which the government takes in the form of forecasts through the IATF. And also, there are many things that need to be balanced, like political and economic interests, especially with the business sector. So there's a need to weigh science outcomes. However, Octa, being called to provide immediate science advice, there is no extended peer review here, and all of these things would have to be translated to the government bureaucracy. Whereas MARINA, on the second column here to your on the right, provides formal science advice with the goal of coming up with a legislative proposal for environmental compliance of the Philippine maritime industry according to the IMO standards. And the regulatory agencies involved here, and especially the economic sectors also, especially the maritime industry, which requires the weighing of science outcomes with some extended peer review of recommendations for translation to the bureaucracy. Now, the government, whether in the science community, is there really a need to formalize structures of science advice? Should the Philippines have a wider but more formal system? Or should the existing informal and formal systems be efficiently linked in a very post-normal science context, which we hope would improve science translation to the bureaucracy? The problem is the Philippines has a small science community, and this is a major challenge for science advice. Thank you very much.